I never imagined I'd feel like a stranger in my own daughter's home. At 73, I had been many things: a husband, a father, a soldier, a teacher. But I never expected that one day I'd become a burden. When my wife passed away and the house we built together began to feel like an empty shell, it seemed natural to move in with my daughter's family. She insisted it was the right thing to do. "You shouldn't be alone, Dad," she said, her voice warm and certain. "Come live with us. The kids will love having you here." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that love would be enough. The first few weeks felt hopeful. My room was comfortable. The grandchildren were curious and playful. My daughter tried to include me in everything: meals, errands, even school events. But slowly, quietly, the walls began to close in. I noticed the sideways glances when I offered advice, the subtle sighs when I asked to change the TV channel, the forced smiles when I spoke about how things used to be. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then came the whispered arguments between my daughter and her husband, the sudden change in how the children spoke to me, the strange discomfort that lingered in every corner of the house. I began to feel like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. And yet, this wasn't just my story. It's the story of thousands of older parents who, with the best of intentions, move in with their children, only to find themselves caught in a web of unspoken resentment, emotional confusion, and invisible loss. It's the story of homes that lose their warmth, of generations that drift apart under the weight of daily misunderstandings, of love that silently turns into obligation. This story isn't about blame, it's about truth. The truth that moving in together, though born from love and care, often opens the door to deeper wounds. The truth that generational gaps can become emotional chasms. That even when we live under the same roof, we can still feel terribly alone. Through my eyes, you'll walk the path I did. The promises, the tension, the heartbreak, and the quiet realizations. We will explore what happens when roles shift, privacy disappears, and dignity starts to fade. We will speak of conflict, of mental and physical decline, of marriages strained and silence growing louder. But this is also a story of awareness, of reclaiming dignity, of understanding what independence really means, and most importantly, of how to love our families without losing ourselves in the process. Because sometimes, protecting the people you love means choosing to stay just far enough to keep the closeness alive. Chapter 1. The space between generations. The distance between generations isn't measured in years, but in silence. I began to notice the space between my daughter and me almost immediately after I moved in. Not a physical space, no, I was only a few steps from her kitchen to my room. But there was a growing emotional gap, subtle at first, like a thread slowly unraveling at the edge of a familiar fabric. In the beginning, I tried to help. I offered to pick the kids up from school, to cook dinner, to wash the dishes after long days. I thought I was easing their burden. Instead, I saw the discomfort in her eyes every time I touched the stove. Her husband, Michael, always found a reason to redo the laundry after I had folded it. Even the kids, once warm and full of questions, began to treat me like a fixture in the house, rather than a person. Our lives, though lived in the same home, were traveling in different directions. I grew up in a time when the family dinner table was sacred, when discipline was firm but gentle, and when elders were listened to, not tolerated. My daughter's home ran on a different rhythm. The children negotiated every decision, talked back without consequence, and meals were often eaten in front of separate screens. When I voiced concern, gently, I thought, it sparked tension I hadn't expected. "You're not in your house anymore, Dad," she said one evening, not unkindly, but with an edge that cut deeper than she realized. That sentence clung to me like a shadow. I wasn't in my house anymore. I wasn't in my world anymore either. I was floating between generations. No longer the authority I once was, but not quite invisible. I was there, but only partly. Present, but uncertain of my place. And then there was the matter of privacy. At first, I didn't mind the lack of space. After all, we were family. But it didn't take long before I missed small things. The quiet of a morning routine, the freedom to listen to music without bothering anyone, the ability to nap without interruption. Children banged on my door when they were upset. My daughter popped in unannounced to drop off laundry or ask for help. Even my books, once a sanctuary, felt like they belonged in someone else's space now. I began to retreat, not out of bitterness but survival. I kept my thoughts to myself. I spent more time in my room. I avoided conversation that might lead to confrontation, and that, perhaps, was the saddest part of it all. I had not moved in with my daughter to become quiet. I had moved in hoping for connection. But instead, we were each building quiet walls around ourselves. Hers of frustration, mine of restraint, and in between, a space neither of us knew how to cross. I started to understand something painful, yet essential. Living together is not the same as being together. And when generational values, parenting philosophies, and communication styles clash within one household, the warmth of home can quickly become the chill of misunderstanding. I often wondered if she felt it too, the ache of good intentions gone wrong. I didn't blame her, I still don't. But I could see with each passing day how hard it was for her to carry the weight of a parent who once led and now lingered. And how hard it was for me to give up the role of father only to feel like a house guest in the home of the very daughter I had raised. That was the real space between us. Not physical, not generational, but the aching space where love remained, yet understanding no longer lived. Chapter 2. The Weight of Being Unseen. It's a strange kind of loneliness, the kind that happens in a house full of people. I had once believed that moving in with my daughter would chase away that hollow quiet that haunted the corners of my home after my wife passed. I thought children's laughter would fill the silence, that shared dinners would warm the evenings, that I would find my place again, not as a man growing old alone, but as a grandfather surrounded by love. But what I discovered instead was that being present doesn't always mean being seen. At first, the signs were small. A conversation I was excluded from at the dinner table, a decision made without asking for my input, an outing planned while I stayed behind. I told myself it didn't matter. I was here for them, not the other way around. But slowly, something inside me began to ache, a soft, dull pain that came from not being needed, or worse, being in the way. There was one evening that etched itself into my heart. My granddaughter had a school recital. I had dressed early, combed my hair, put on the old blue blazer my wife had once said made me look like a gentleman. But when I came down the stairs, the car was already pulling out of the driveway. I stood there, confused, watching as the taillights disappeared into the distance. No one had thought to ask if I wanted to come. No one had even remembered to tell me it was happening that night. When they returned, my daughter blinked in surprise. "Oh, Dad, I thought you were resting. I didn't think you'd want to go." I wanted to scream, "You didn't ask." But I didn't. I just smiled and nodded. I was learning, slowly and painfully, that speaking up often led to tension. So I said nothing. I became quieter, and in doing so, I began to disappear from the life around me. There's a certain invisibility that creeps into old age, not because we choose it, but because the world moves so fast it forgets to look back. You start to feel like furniture, part of the background, useful when needed, but mostly just there. I had never imagined that the worst kind of loneliness wasn't physical distance, but emotional disconnection, being in the same room as your loved ones, yet feeling like you don't exist. And that kind of feeling, it changes you. I began waking up later, not out of laziness, but because the morning no longer had anything waiting for me. I ate in silence, sometimes alone, sometimes at the table with my daughter and her family while they stared into their phones or spoke over me. I found myself staring out the window more often, counting the birds, watching the trees, searching for something, anything, that would remind me that I still had a place in the world. Worse than the loneliness was the shame that came with it. I didn't want to seem needy or dramatic. I didn't want to be a burden. So I buried my emotions. I nodded, I smiled, I pretended that things were okay. But inside, I was shrinking. My sense of worth, once so firmly tied to my role as father, provider, teacher, was fading. And then came the anxiety. I began to second-guess everything. Was I talking too much? Taking up too much space? Being too old-fashioned? Even small requests, like asking for help reaching a jar or attending a doctor's appointment, felt like transgressions. I didn't want to inconvenience anyone, so I stopped asking. I convinced myself that it was better to go without than to risk rejection. But that's the cruel trick of this kind of life. The more invisible you feel, the more you hide. And the more you hide, the more invisible you become. And that invisibility, it doesn't just hurt your heart, it begins to seep into your body. I started forgetting things. My sleep was restless. My chest felt tight more often. I would walk into a room and not remember why I went there. I chalked it up to age at first, but deep down I knew. It wasn't just aging, it was sadness. Quiet, deep sadness that eats away at the mind when it has no voice, no outlet, no one who truly sees it. One evening, I overheard my daughter talking to her husband in the kitchen. "I feel bad," she said. "I know Dad's lonely, but I just don't have time for this right now. The kids, work, bills, he'll be fine." I was just down the hall, close enough to hear, close enough to feel the sting of being reduced to an afterthought. That night, I sat alone in my room, the walls pressing in. I didn't cry, but I felt something worse. A numbness. A quiet surrender. The kind that makes you question why you're still here, what role you still play, what meaning remains when your voice no longer echoes in the rooms you inhabit. And yet, even in the quiet, a part of me held on. Because deep down, I still believed that my life had value, that my presence mattered, that the years I carried and the stories I held had worth. But I also knew this: if I didn't fight to be seen, no one else would fight for me. That realization would change everything. But before I could take that step, I had to face the truth that love, no matter how deep, cannot survive without recognition, and no person, no matter how strong, can thrive in a place where they feel invisible. Chapter 3. When the body speaks, the mind's pain. I always believed I had a strong body. After all, it had carried me through war zones, long work hours, storms, and sleepless nights with sick children. It had served me well through 7 decades. But I didn't realize how quietly the mind can poison the body, especially when the soul begins to dim. After a few months of living with my daughter, I began feeling tired in a way I couldn't explain. Not the kind of tired a nap could fix, but a deep, slow heaviness that made it hard to get out of bed. I used to walk every morning. After breakfast, I'd lace up my shoes and enjoy the stillness of the neighborhood. That habit faded. First it was the cold, then the rain, then the simple fact that I no longer felt motivated to go. My joints stiffened, my blood pressure crept higher, my memory became cloudy. I would sit down for a meal and forget if I had already taken my pills. My doctor mentioned that aging came with some fog, but deep down I knew this wasn't just age. This was emotional wear and tear. Every unspoken hurt, every moment I bit back my opinion, every look that said, "Stay out of this," added weight to my shoulders, and that weight eventually showed itself in my body. I began losing appetite. Meals became mechanical. I barely noticed the taste of food anymore. I was eating just to keep going. Sometimes I wondered why I was still trying so hard to keep going. It all came to a head one afternoon when I collapsed in the hallway. I don't remember falling, only waking up on the couch with Michael and my daughter hovering over me. The worry in her eyes felt genuine, maybe for the first time in weeks. But even then, it came with guilt. Not mine, hers. "You need to take better care of yourself, Dad," she said, almost like a plea. I wanted to say, "I'm trying," but the words didn't come. What would she have heard anyway? That my spirit had been wearing out in this house? That I felt like I no longer had permission to live on my own terms? The truth is, our bodies are honest in a way our mouths often are not. Mine had started telling a story of neglect, not from lack of food or shelter, but from a lack of purpose, a lack of voice, a lack of place. I started seeing it clearly then. When the emotional world collapses, the physical one begins to follow. Stress had become a silent killer in my system. The constant tension, the walking on eggshells, the subtle pressure to not overstep. I had absorbed it all, and my body had kept the score. What frightened me most wasn't the health scare itself. It was the realization that I no longer felt in control of my own wellness. I was depending on others, on their schedules, their routines, their rules. Even when it came to what I ate or when I took my pills, it had started to feel like I was a passenger. For someone who once taught others how to lead, how to take care of themselves, how to be strong, this felt like a quiet humiliation. And yet there was one small mercy in all of this. That fall forced a conversation. It made my daughter pause. For the first time in a long time, she asked, "Are you really okay here, Dad?" I didn't have the courage to answer her fully, not yet. But I saw a crack in the wall between us, a chance, maybe, to reclaim a little space, a little self. But I also knew healing wouldn't come from one moment of concern. It had to start with me. And for that, I had to rediscover the courage to take my life and my health back into my own hands. Chapter 4. Sharing a roof, losing a role. It's one thing to move into your child's home. It's another to move out of your own life. Before I came to live with my daughter, I was still someone. I had my own keys, my own bills, my own schedule. I chose what time to get up, what news to read, what groceries to buy, what music to play while I cooked lunch. It might sound small, but it meant everything. That quiet rhythm, built over years of self-reliance, gave me purpose. It reminded me that I was still in charge of my life. But when I moved into my daughter's home, that rhythm disappeared. At first I told myself I was adjusting, that this was just part of the natural cycle of aging, that being cared for was a privilege, not a loss. But over time, something inside me started to unravel, not because anyone mistreated me, but because I no longer had a role to play. The father who once fixed broken sinks, who taught his children how to ride a bike and file taxes and drive a car, that man had faded. Now, I was someone who rested, who waited, who watched. My daughter ran the household. Michael handled the finances. The children barely looked up from their devices. I became the quiet presence in the background. No one asked for my opinion anymore. Not on parenting, not on bills, not even on what to eat for dinner. Decisions were made around me, not with me. And worse, I began to doubt myself. I would think of something to say, then stop. Is this my place? Will they take it the wrong way? Sometimes I heard them argue in the next room. I knew it was about me, not always with anger, but always with frustration. "I can't do this all the time," Michael once said, not knowing I was awake. "I didn't sign up to have your dad living here forever." I felt it in my chest like a slow punch. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did. I hadn't come here to be a problem. I had come here to matter. But when you're no longer providing, when you're no longer needed, you start to wonder who you are now. One afternoon, while my daughter was out running errands, my grandson came into my room and asked me, "Grandpa, why don't you work anymore?" I smiled, unsure how to answer. "Because I already did for a long time," I said. He nodded, then looked down. "Do you get bored now?" That question stuck with me. Because the truth was, I did. Not because I had nothing to do, but because I had no one expecting anything from me. There's something quietly devastating about no longer being expected. In the months that followed, I tried to make myself useful. I cooked sometimes, I folded laundry, I offered to take the kids to their after-school activities, but there was always a polite decline, or worse, a change of plans I wasn't told about. Slowly, I stopped offering. And then I started forgetting who I used to be. That's what no one tells you about aging. It's not just your body that fades, it's your identity. When you lose your place in the family, you start to lose your place in the world. I remember once standing in the hallway, watching Michael hang a frame that had tilted slightly. I used to do that. I used to fix things without being asked. But now, even the hammer wasn't mine to hold. It may sound silly, it may sound small, but those little things, the ones we build our usefulness on, they are the last threads of dignity, and once they're gone, the silence grows louder. I wanted to believe I still mattered, but in a house where I had no decisions to make, no responsibilities to fulfill, and no voice in how things were run, that belief was harder to hold on to. What I didn't realize yet was that dignity doesn't always come from what you do for others. Sometimes, it comes from what you refuse to give up for yourself. But that understanding would come later. For now, I was still grieving the man I used to be. Chapter 5. The Marriage Next Door. When I first moved in, I didn't think much about the whispers behind closed doors. I believed that families adapted, that love would find its way even when the walls grew tight. But over time, I began to notice the cracks, not in my room, but in theirs. My daughter and her husband had once been easy with each other. There were soft jokes in the kitchen, long conversations after the kids went to bed, the kind of gentle rhythm that speaks of comfort built over years. But as my presence settled into their home, that rhythm began to change. It was subtle at first. Michael came home later, often muttering something about last-minute meetings. My daughter grew quiet during dinner, her voice strained when she asked the children to behave. Their laughter became rare, replaced by short exchanges, unfinished sentences, glances that didn't quite meet. I told myself it wasn't because of me, but of course it was. Not because I did anything wrong, but because my being there, however unspoken, became an uninvited weight on their relationship. There were evenings when I heard them argue through the walls, not shouting, but the tense kind of conversation that sits heavily in the air. "You always take his side," Michael said one night, his voice low and tight. "He's my father," she replied. "He has nowhere else to go." "I didn't marry your father. I married you." I felt those words like a blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Michael hadn't signed up for this. My daughter hadn't either. But love is messy, and sometimes it calls us to carry more than we can hold. Still, I couldn't deny what was happening. My presence had changed the balance. There were now 3 adults under one roof trying to lead, each with different rhythms, different expectations, and in that crowded dynamic, something was quietly breaking. Even the children began to sense it. My grandson once asked me, "Are Mommy and Daddy mad at each other because you live here now?" I didn't know how to answer. But what struck me most wasn't just the tension. It was the distance that grew between them. They no longer touched casually in the kitchen. Their bedroom doors stayed closed longer in the mornings. Conversations became about logistics, bills, school pickups, meals, not about dreams or plans or love. I wanted to leave, not because I felt unloved, but because I didn't want to be the reason they loved each other less. But where would I go? I had sold my house, I had no place else, and so I stayed. And in staying, I watched my daughter stretch herself thin between roles, wife, mother, caregiver. I watched Michael grow resentful in silence. And I watched their marriage slowly become a routine of responsibilities instead of a place of rest. What none of us expected was that love has limits when space is gone. They tried, I know they did, but trying isn't the same as thriving, and the more my needs filled their days, the less room they had for each other. One evening, my daughter came into my room after the kids had gone to bed. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders tense. She sat beside me and said, "I feel like I'm losing everything. Him, the kids, and you." I wanted to say, "You haven't lost me, I'm still here." But I also knew what she meant. She was losing the home she once had, the peace, the ease, the balance. And I, in my silent gratitude and guilt, had unknowingly helped that happen. It was one of the hardest truths I had to face, that sometimes even love can become too heavy to carry under one roof. I began to understand that caring for one person can sometimes come at the quiet cost of a relationship between 2 others, and that cost, though unspoken, leaves wounds that take years to heal. I did not blame them, I did not blame myself, but I did begin to wonder what love looks like when it becomes a burden. Chapter 6. The Echo of Being Left Behind. The strangest thing about being forgotten is that it never happens all at once. It creeps in quietly, like a shadow that grows longer each day until you realize you're standing alone in the dark. I began to notice it on ordinary mornings. The kids would rush past me, late for school, barely mumbling a greeting. My daughter would be juggling phone calls and lunch boxes, barely noticing if I was at the table. Michael had stopped making eye contact altogether. The house was full, but I had never felt so invisible. I don't think they meant to leave me behind. Life had simply moved on, faster than I could keep up. Their schedules were tight, their energy was pulled in a dozen directions. I was there, but not part of the rhythm. I was in the background, reliable, quiet, undemanding. And so I began to fade from the center of their lives without anyone realizing it. What hurt most was the realization that no one needed to talk to me to get through the day anymore. Once, I had been the first phone call, the problem solver, the storyteller, the person who could make sense of things when everything felt uncertain. But now, conversations passed over my head. Decisions were made without me. Even my stories began to feel like relics, sweet but outdated, like family heirlooms that no longer matched the furniture. And the more I felt left behind, the more I retreated into myself. I stopped trying to join in on conversations. I stayed in my room longer. I read the same pages of books over and over without really absorbing them. I told myself it was better this way, less burden for them, less disappointment for me. But inside, I was aching. One afternoon, I stood by the window watching the family pile into the car. I hadn't been invited. I didn't know where they were going. They hadn't even said goodbye. I waited for the sound of the engine fading down the street before I sat back down. The silence afterward was suffocating. The hours passed like fog. That evening, when they returned, my granddaughter ran straight to her tablet. Michael disappeared into the garage. My daughter handed me a takeout container without a word. I smiled politely, but inside I was screaming. "Do you see me? Do you remember who I am?" But I said nothing, because I had learned that my silence made everything easier. It wasn't just being forgotten that hurt. It was the slow, creeping fear that I no longer mattered. That even if I disappeared, life would go on with barely a ripple. There's a kind of grief in that. A grief not for death, but for meaning, for presence, for relevance. It eats away at your spirit slowly, like rust. I began dreaming often of my wife. In those dreams, we were back in our home. She was in the kitchen, I was on the porch, and everything felt steady. She would smile at me and say, "You still have more to give." And I would wake up with tears in my eyes, because I didn't know where to give it anymore. That was the echo I lived with each day, the fading echo of who I used to be. And yet, even in that stillness, something deep within me whispered that I wasn't finished, that there was still a part of me that wanted to be seen, heard, remembered. But to be seen again, I would have to step back into the light. I would have to speak up, to draw boundaries, to make space for myself again, not out of anger, but out of love for the person I still was inside. And that would be the hardest part. Chapter 7, Dignity Begins with Distance. I once believed that being close to family meant being under the same roof, that proximity would naturally bring connection, warmth, and care. But the longer I stayed, the clearer it became. Love suffocates without space, and dignity fades without boundaries. The turning point didn't come in the form of a grand moment. It came one morning, as quietly as the seasons change. I was sitting on the porch alone, the air cool, the light soft. The children were at school, the house was still. My daughter stepped outside, coffee in hand, her face pale from exhaustion. She sat beside me, not saying a word for a long while. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "Dad, I don't think this is working." Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with something far more fragile, guilt. I nodded, not because I was hurt, but because I had already come to the same truth. "I think about it every day," I replied, "not because I want to leave, but because I don't want to disappear in front of you." She looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in what felt like months. And in that moment, we were no longer parent and child in a power struggle. We were two tired souls, both trying to hold on to something that had already changed. Living together had blurred every line of respect, responsibility, affection, and in trying to protect each other, we had quietly begun to hurt each other. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear. I began looking into independent senior living options. Not a nursing home, not a place where I would fade into gray walls and routine medication, but a modest apartment near the park, close enough to visit often, but far enough to breathe, to think, to be, and more importantly, to reclaim my voice. The day I moved out, there were no dramatic goodbyes, just a hug from my daughter, a soft "call me when you're settled," and a quiet ride in the car with Michael, who didn't say much but carried every box carefully. My new place was small, just a few rooms, simple furniture, bare walls. But as I unpacked, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: ownership. These were my things, arranged how I liked. My books returned to my shelves, my routines, my pace, my silence. And that first night, as I lay in bed alone, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt free. In the weeks that followed, everything changed, not in big ways, but in honest ones. My daughter called more. When she visited, she stayed longer. The grandchildren began to look forward to our time together. I found myself smiling again. Not because I was trying to fit in, but because I was finally standing on my own ground. Distance hadn't broken us. It had saved us. Because dignity, I learned, does not grow in dependency. It grows in freedom, in space, in the quiet strength of being able to say, "I love you, but I need to be myself too." I had not lost my family. I had simply stepped far enough away to truly find them again. Chapter 8. Love Seen Clearly. They say that love never truly fades. It only gets buried beneath the noise. In my case, it was buried beneath shared walls, unspoken frustrations, and the quiet grief of roles reversed. But now, living in my own space again, something beautiful began to happen. I saw my daughter, not as my caregiver, not as the stressed mother of two, but as the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read her stories. I saw her not with disappointment, but with understanding. She had done her best. We both had. We were simply trying to hold on to love in the wrong shape. Our Sunday visits became sacred. She'd bring the kids, and we'd have lunch in the small kitchen of my new apartment. I had pictures on the walls, books neatly stacked, and flowers by the window. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And because it was mine, I felt whole again. The grandchildren began to ask questions about my youth, about their grandmother, about the world before smartphones and chaos. I had stories again, not because they were new, but because now someone wanted to hear them. And perhaps most of all, I saw myself again. Not as a burden, not as a shell of who I once was, but as a man who still had value, wisdom, presence. There was no bitterness left, just clarity. Because what I'd learned, perhaps too late for some, but not too late for me, is this: to love deeply, you must also know when to step back. To remain close, sometimes you must live apart. And to hold on to dignity, you must never let go of yourself. That's what living with my daughter taught me, not through peace, but through trial. And now, when I hug her goodbye at the door, when the children wave and shout, "See you next week, Grandpa," I no longer ache for what I've lost. I smile, because now I see clearly, and that is the most precious gift of all. Closing message for the audience. Thank you for listening to this story. Maybe it reminded you of your own parents, or maybe of yourself. If you're considering moving in with your children, or if your parents are considering moving in with you, pause for a moment. Think about space, about respect, about dignity. Love doesn't always mean living under the same roof. Sometimes love is strongest when it has room to breathe. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts or personal experiences. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that bring wisdom, reflection, and emotional insight, especially for those navigating aging, family, and the delicate balance between care and independence. Click the bell icon so you won't miss the next video. See you next time on our journey to understand life, love, and the quiet strength of growing older with grace. Until then, take care of yourself and take care of each other.